I wanted to begin this analysis by applauding Ubisoft Singapore for implementing many of the improvements introduced in previous Assassin's Creed titles, particularly for Mirage and Shadows. For being the version that we got from launch, the parkour and movement system shipped in a very satisfying state. Although there are a few details that I noticed that I would like to discuss later in this video. It's honestly refreshing to see an Assassin's Creed title launch with such a strong foundation. From the very beginning of the campaign, you're introduced to the game movement mechanics and shown almost everything the parkour system has to offer. It's clear the developers took the lessons learned from previous entries and worked to make the system feel as complete as possible from day one. Personally, I am glad to see parkour become a major focus again. On top of that, the cities have been redesigned to support a much smoother traversal experience. One thing I was initially concerned about was tree climbing. I expected it to be restricted to a handful of designated areas, similar to what we saw in AZ Shadows, where certain traversal paths relied on yellow wooden planks. Instead, I was surprised to see Ubisoft fully commit to bringing this mechanic back. Mirage did include tree climbing, but it never felt nearly as prominent as it does in Resynced. So once again, credit to Ubisoft for expanding this system. Of course, it's unfortunate that the original Kenway parkour system didn't return. However, I am glad the modern RPG movement system makes a genuine effort to recreate many of the classic mechanics, particularly parkour up and parkour down. Unfortunately, this isn't without its shortcomings. Before I get into those, I want to talk about what I believe is the biggest issue holding this movement system back, and that's the default controller layout. If you stick with the default controls, there's a good chance you'll find movement more frustrating than it needs to be. The layout feels awkward and doesn't encourage players to fully explore the potential of the new parkour system. My biggest request to the developers would be to revisit the controller layout and make it more movement focused. I understand this isn't a simple task. It would likely require redesigning the control scheme without interfering with combat, stealth, or the newer mechanics. But Mirage proved that this can be done, and I am confident something similar could work here. After spending more than 30 hours with the game, I eventually became comfortable with the movement mechanics and was able to traverse the world with very little friction. Now, the next issue I'm about to mention may be specific to my controller, so I want to make it clear that this could simply be a personal experience. While using a controller, I consistently found myself needing to release a sprint button before I could perform parkour up or parkour down. Interestingly, I couldn't reproduce this behavior when using a keyboard and mouse, which leads me to believe it may be related to the controller bindings rather than the movement system itself. Thinking about it afterward, I realized I had customized my controller layout specifically by remapping the sprint button to RT from Xbox, or R2 if you are on PlayStation. That may explain why the inputs weren't behaving as intended. So this could be very well an issue specific to my setup, rather than the game itself. Even so, I hope Ubisoft looks into expanding the controller customization options. Ideally, I'd like to see enough flexibility to recreate a control scheme that's closer to the classic Assassin's Creed titles, without introducing conflicts between movement inputs. Moving on to my next point, I noticed an odd interaction while running across rooftops. Whenever Edward encounters small steps, crates, or planks lying on the ground, he often refuses to step over them unless you manually press parkour up. In some situations, You will suddenly stop moving forward, only to realize that the game expected you to trigger parkour up to clear what appears to be a very small obstacle. It leaves you wondering why Edward couldn't simply step over these objects naturally instead of forcing an extra input. This isn't common enough to justify an urgent fix, but I do think it's worth revisiting because smoothing out interactions like these would make traversal feel much more fluid. Another improvement I really appreciate is the sprinting mechanic. The transition from jogging to sprinting now feels more natural. Unlike AC Shadows, I never felt the need to avoid sprinting because of an overly aggressive speed increase. Overall, I think this is a significant improvement. The only adjustment I would recommend is reducing the delay before Edward reaches full sprint speed. Whether recovering from a fall, climbing over an obstacle, or finishing an animation, there's a brief pause before sprinting fully resumes. Tightening that transition would help players maintain momentum during longer parkour sequences. Finally, I like to talk about roll recovery. I appreciate that this ability is available from the start instead of being locked behind a skill tree. However, I do think it could activate from lower heights than it currently does. There are many situations where Edward lands from a moderate height and briefly stumbles before recovering. Those moments aren't high enough to trigger a roll, but they still interrupt the flow of movement. Allowing roll recovery to activate from slightly lower heights would help preserve momentum, while also making traversal feel more stylish. These observations may sound like minor nitpicks, but I genuinely believe that adjusting these small details would result in a much smoother movement system overall. And finally, although I don't have footage to demonstrate this point, I would love to see Ubisoft bring back Mirage diagonal climbing. At the moment, climbing is largely restricted to vertical movement, and reintroducing diagonal climbing would give players even more freedom while navigating the environment.